When I'm studying or preparing to give a drash, I must admit that I am often struck by, well, frankly, the bizarreness of the stories of the Torah. And this week's Parsha does not disappoint. Now, for several weeks, nearly half the book of Exodus and into the first chapters of Leviticus, we have read about the preparations for the moment when God will bring God's presence to rest among the people. 5 weekly Torah portions constituting 15 chapters give us the very detailed instructions for building the Mishkan. 2 more Torah portions describe at great length the sacrificial offerings to be brought to the Mishkan. And for 7 days, the Kohanim, Aaron and his sons, are consecrated into office. Now here we are in Shemini. We've reached the 8th day when the service of the Mishkan will begin. The stage is set. Everything is ready. We've got calves, goats, lamb, and oxen. There is much slaughtering, prepping, and offerings. And with a simple verse, the story reaches its peak. Moshe and Aaron went into the tent of meeting, and when they came out, they blessed the people. And the presence of the Lord appeared to all the people. All, it seemed, was right with the world. But then, in what initially may sound a bit like a drunken fraternity prank, 2 of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, essentially snuck into the Mishkan and offered Eish Zara, the alien or strange fire. Except it turned out to be not so funny. Apparently, it was unauthorized activity. We don't really know why they did it. Rashi hypothesizes that they were intoxicated, which would explain God's directive to Aaron just a few verses later, not to drink wine and get intoxicated before going into the Mishkan. But in any case, Nadav and Avihu had crossed a line, evidently an important line. And they were punished by God, who sent 2 threads of fire into each one's nostrils, destroying their souls along with their internal organs, but leaving their external bodies intact. You can see what I'm saying about the weird stories. We then move from death and burnt offerings to God telling Moshe and Aaron to tell the people of Israel what they can and cannot eat. Cloven hoofs and Cheez-Its cut, bon appetit. Bacon and pork chops, unclean for you. A nice piece of salmon, enjoy, but lobster and shrimp, an abomination. And this Shabbat is also Shabbat Parah, the Shabbat of the red heifer, where the Maftir reading deals with the unblemished red heifer whose ashes combined with water to ritually purify anyone who has been in contact with a dead person. More than one commentary describes this as a strange ritual and the classic example of a law that defies rational explanation. Now, to me, among the gifts of studying Torah is that you can find insight, connections, meaning, and of course more questions, even in the strangest rituals and in complicated and sometimes distressing laws. But it's that middle space that interests me the most. That place between accepting the pshat, that is the literal meaning of the plain text on the page, and hitting the delete key. It's asking what is the relevance of this text to us, even when it is hard and uncomfortable. So somewhat surprisingly, even to me, I'd like to talk a bit tonight about boundaries, purity and impurity, clean and unclean. Why the fixation? What functions do they serve? Before I delve into this, I'd like to clarify here what I'm talking about when I refer to clean and unclean, pure and impure, or an abomination. And I'm going to quote Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, who, if you don't follow her on Twitter, I'd strongly encourage you to. I've probably learned more from her tweets than from all my years of Hebrew school. So as Rabbi Ruttenberg tweeted this week, any translation of unclean or impure that implies moral judgment should be immediately suspect. A better translation for tuma or tahara, the state of being ritually impure and pure, she says, would be everyday state, an elevated state. That is, a ritual state that happens to people. that people exist in, but not because they did something wrong. So with that as the translation, what, for example, is the point of not eating pork or shrimp? Why was the strange fire such a problem? And why is it that someone who comes in contact with a dead body essentially gets modern-day cooties and can only become ritually pure with red heifer ashes? There is, of course, the because God said so rationale. And indeed, that works and is satisfying to many. And arguably we could end there. But for me, well, I'll just say, because I said so didn't sit so well with me when my mother said it either. I'd like a little more. Some, particularly in the area of kashrut, have suggested there are hygienic or health reasons, for example, refraining from eating pork. They say by not eating pork, we prevent trichinosis. Trichinosis. I guess that's not a bad explanation, at least for bacon. But considering this question in the context of this week's Parsha, where we have what seem to be three arbitrary and unconnected elements, the Kohanim assuming their duties, Nadav and Avihu's deaths, and the laws of kashrut, all coming at the culmination of weeks and weeks of details about the building of the Mishkan. That explanation is simply insufficient. So here's my theory about why we have these distinctions or boundaries here of pure and impure, clean and unclean, about the purpose they serve. First, we need to go back and start with the Mishkan. We spend chapter after chapter reading about the gold, the silver, the copper, blue, purple, and crimson yarns, the wood, stones, wool, and linen, all the Israelites contributing materials to build this place. Why? What was that place for? Why was it so important to the Israelites? It was a sanctuary, a physical, mobile construction from the individual items voluntarily brought by each person. A sacred space. And think about it against the backdrop of God's creation of the universe. God created a place for us to dwell. We created a place for God. It was a way for us to know God, to find God, to be in relationship with God. In Torah, and arguably in Judaism more broadly, there is nothing more important than our relationship to God, being in relationship with God. It underpins everything, our studying, our social justice work, our prayers, our mitzvot. It is ultimately why we do what we do. And God doesn't want anything to get in the way of our ability to love God and be loved by God. So the relevance, I believe, is that we need to eliminate the things that get in the way of being in relationship with God and foster or elevate things that allow us to grow close. It's about creating a kind of scaffolding through rituals and boundaries that maximizes our ability to connect with God. Accordingly, it's reasonable to deduce that things that bring us closer to or support being in relationship with God are pure, clean, to be encouraged, and things that get in the way of that relationship or separate us from God would, or at least should, be forbidden, unclean, impure. So then it seems only logical to inquire what else separates us from God. As I contemplated this parsha and question in the context of this convening, and as we approached transdev visibility, the foundation for this drash became clear. Not being able to be safely who we are would be something that separates us from God, that interferes with that relationship. Said another way, being who we are, our fabulous trans, non-binary, genderqueer, gender non-conforming selves, is pure, it is clean, and it is also very sacred. Not being who we are, or more accurately, not being permitted to be who we are, particularly in Jewish space, is morally unclean, impure, an abomination. And I say to our allies, lifting up the wisdom of Miss Major, it is your sacred work to be visible on Trans Day of Visibility, to speak out as allies, to chaver up, if you will, to see the ways that you, our organizations, institutions, communities, create obstacles or fail to address those barriers that separate transgender and gender nonconforming people from a relationship with God and from our communities. I'd encourage you to read Rabbi Becky Silverstein's smart article posted this week on Jewish Boston, where he identifies concrete steps for Jewish communities to take to make sure that we are not only visible, but also feel seen. So as we enter this Shabbat and this convening, and as we approach Trans Day visibility, I urge each of us to consider how being here, being visible to ourselves and God, as trans people and as allies, being who we are in a way to not only love ourselves, but it is precisely how God wants to be in relationship with us, to love us and to be loved by us. Shabbat Shalom.